once upon a time, when I worked for the South Pacific Division in Australia and in the Pacific Islands, I was approached by a man who obviously did not want to believe that the creation account in the Bible was intended to be real. And he proposed to me that Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 are to be read as fairy tales. My reply to him was, but where are the fairies? Welcome to yet another tidbit from the book of the Bible. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen. In this particular quarter, we are following along with the themes of the quarterly Bible studies published by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And today and for the next week, we're looking in particular at the creation account in Genesis and its impact and its significance for the Bible as a whole. And the question I would raise in particular today is, how are we to read the Genesis accounts? That is, what kind of literature is it, or spoken in more technical terms, what is the genre? I always have a problem when my students complain that I'm not pronouncing this is quite correct. The genre, G-E-N-R-E. What is the genre? And evidently, it's not a fairy tale. And many other genres have been proposed. It's a myth, it's a legend, and so on. Now, before I move back in particular to the Genesis account in chapters 1 to 3, I want to ask a question. What is the significance of identifying the genre of any biblical book? And it is a particular genre will create certain expectations. Take the genre of a fairy tale. Because of the particular form and the way it is expressed, readers or those who listen will recognize and immediately know this is not intended to be history. When you read an epistle or a letter, and you have some of those in the Bible, you would immediately, when you know it is a letter from the form, you will expect certain things. You expect some personal greetings, which of course is common throughout also the biblical letters or epistles. When you read a genealogy, you expect certain things. When you read a law, that is a section of legal nature, you also expect certain things. So when it is said, for instance, as a case example of a law, if a man does this and this, then you do expect a certain type of language. You don't expect a genealogy suddenly to pop up in the midst of the law. So genre is about expectations. We have many different genres in the Bible. We have narratives, and narratives can be subdivided into many kinds of narratives. We have a parable, which is also a kind of narrative. We have prophecy, but within the genre of prophecy, we have apocalyptic prophecy. We have visions and dreams and vision reports. We have, as already stated, letters or epistles. We have the specific kind of literature that we have in the Gospels. And the Gospels actually belong to the ancient form for a biography. And that raises already an issue. Now, our expectations for a genre should not be imposed on the Bible from our day, but from the time of the Bible itself. A genealogy should not be a kind of literature where we expect the completeness that we will have in a modern genealogy, because that was not the expectations of the time. In a biography today, we would often expect all kinds of details that we don't find in the Gospels. But nevertheless, the Gospels fulfill the expectations that ancient readers would have to a book that describes a significant person and his accomplishments. And then the Acts of the Apostles belongs to a genre of succession literature, succession narrative, where you tell about the impact on that original figure on his successors. Now, that means that our expectations when we have a certain genre in mind should not be imposed from our day, but it should be taken from within the time of the Bible. But one thing more. Any author may actually deliberately, or because he's a bad author, I could do that, may actually change or surprise people. That is, he may change expectations. Authors often put in the Bible a piece of poetry in the midst of the narrative, or suddenly you have major sermons or speeches, like in the book of Acts, that permeate the book and put a significant mark on those books. Or you can simply surprise readers. You have a kind of literature genre that most of my listeners would be familiar with, that is the genre of a sermon. If you, in the midst of the sermon, suddenly break into song, you surprise people, you break the expectations, but that may be done very efficiently. And so the authors may actually do that at times, even in the biblical stories and the biblical text. So back to the Genesis account. The question is, what kind of literature is it? And most scholars end up saying it has its own genre, a Latin phrase, sui generis. But when that is said, you can detect some genre elements. Most obvious is this is like a genealogy. And actually, the first of the two accounts, we have one from chapter 1, which ends in chapter 2, verse 4a, and then you have another aspect, you have two that supplement each other. That the term that is used at the end of this first account is, this is the Toledot. That is a Hebrew term which usually is translated as genealogy. And besides this one occurrence in Genesis, you have it in 10 other situations. Some scholars think that you can almost structure the book of Genesis along the lines of the Toledot. That may be an exaggeration, but certainly they are important for the way the book is structured. So what that means is that the creation, the first, before you had the 10 normal genealogies, the creation account is a genealogy, meaning it is historical. That is the very intention. In a genealogy, when you say, he was the son of this one or the father of this one, the one purpose is to link the events to specific sequence of history. So a genealogy is something that puts the stories and narratives into history. And this is exactly the point in Genesis 1 and 2. This is said to be, told to be a part of history. You have other elements that point to different kinds of genre. You have the issue of dividing or separating, which is typical for some of the priestly descriptions later on in the Torah. That is common for the first chapter, or the first of the two so-called accounts. Now, when we say two accounts, it's simply because chapter 1 to 2a has this majestic sequential description with the 7 days, and the word seven or the number seven plays an important role in that whole account. And then suddenly you become far more down to earth. In the first, you have God, Elohim, creating using the verb bara, which is used only with God as a subject. And he creates heaven and earth. That is a merism defining everything. In chapter 4b, chapter 2, verse 4b, when you begin again, you have the reverse. It's not only, it's God Yahweh, it's God the Lord, Yahweh Elohim. And the sequence is now not heaven, earth, but earth and heaven. And the verb that is used, asa, is the verb for form, doing. It's not the same as bara. Now, the differences are so strikingly identical, you could say, deliberately, that you see this is a literary ploy. The two accounts that we often, the many read as contradictory, actually supplement each other. The first is the majestic outline of the seventh day of creation, and then you move into the specifics of the first home of the humans and creation of the marriage in particular. Now, it's literature. It's told with a literary finesse, and some would say, oh, then it can't be historical. That is misunderstanding. Even the historical accounts in the Old Testament and the New are written as literature. So the fact that it is literary, well composed, has nothing to do whether it's true or not. But the fact that it is written the way it is, with reference to generality, with a language where there are no fairies, certainly indicates this was intended to be understood as real. Don't get me wrong. The genre is not science. Scientific language or scientific description is a modern genre, which we should not impose on the Bible. So what is told would have been understood as real, but the expectations you and I today would have to a scientific account is not necessarily fulfilled. And why should it be? The type of account that deals with the creation of the world and the first human beings in itself is a type of account that in the ancient world would have been used to say, and this is how we today should live. In other words, an account like this, by its very nature, would be understood by its first readers as laying out the essential principles for life. Now, in contrast to Mesopotamian stories about the beginning, the focus in Genesis 1 is on God, because the very concept of the creation, which is new and different, would indicate that God is in the center. And the very concept of creation is linked to history. It is in the nature of creation as a concept that it deals with reality. God created. If it was not real, it would not make sense to call it creation. So history is linked to this, history in the sense of past reality. So these narratives or these accounts, generalities, how we would label it, they are in a way the basis for understanding the subsequent narrative of the Bible about creation, fall, and cross, and second coming. Second coming means recreation and would be meaningless without the concept of creation. And the cross as redemption would also be meaningless if we were not redeemed from the fall. And the fall only makes sense if there was an ideal created being before the fall. Thank you for listening to this tidbit, and we'll move on with reflections on the significance of creation as we continue with our next tidbit.